happening.
Now, Shane Jones says he loves the idea of work for the dole, and he's going to take a work for the dole scheme to Cabinet before Christmas. Do you support work for the dole?
As Mr Jones also said, he is very aware of Labour's position around work for the dole actually being called ready for work. The really important distinction between the two, and Mr Jones makes this distinction himself, is that unlike past work for the dole schemes where people would be expected to do genuine work but not receive a legal minimum wage, our expectation is that if you are doing a job that is a genuine job, you should be receiving a minimum wage.
Yeah, but he's saying, I'm calling it for work for the dole. He's your Cabinet Minister.
Yeah, look...
You're talking about Labour proposals and New Zealand. I mean, there's one government, isn't it?
Yeah, so he's used the words work for the dole, but has also said that it will have a minimum wage. That's the important part for us.
So 4 proposals before Christmas?
Yes, and I've spoken with him. Obviously, there's a bit of work to be done. He's having meetings today, importantly, with our Employment Minister, Willie Jackson, who does hold primary responsibility for areas like what we're doing to get the 70,000 plus young people not in employment, education and training into work. So there is work going on as we speak, but here's an expectation that Cabinet will be able to consider this before Christmas.
Did you know he was going to talk about a work for the dole scheme on television yesterday?
Oh, he's been talking about this issue for a while. So Shane and I have spoken about this.
Did you know that he was going to go on TV yesterday and
look,
talk about a work for the dole scheme?
On every day my ministers are having interviews, and I don't know the content of every single interview they do, and nor do I expect that I would. But we've had...
That's interesting in itself, because he's a Cabinet Minister. There's a Cabinet collective here. I'm asking you, did you know he was going to go on telly and talk about a work for the dole scheme?
No, but I do not, as I've said, nor do I know the content of every single interview that my ministers undertake in any given day. That would be unwieldy, and I think that would go beyond most people's expectations. Yeah. But I have had conversations with Minister Jones about this issue on a couple of occasions before. So, yes, we have talked about this.
So are we going to have a work for the dole scheme?
We've got a similar program called Ready for Work. He's using different language.
Who's the we?
Labour and as a coalition government.
That's the thing, though, eh? It's a government.
Look, Guyon, let's be honest.
But so what are we going to get? Are we going to get?
You're quibbling here over 2 different names, and the issue is whether or not people will be paid a wage. That, for me, is the biggest issue, and Mr Jones has been very clear that they will.
So he's the Cabinet Minister in charge of this, though, right? And he's saying, I'm going to have a work for the dole scheme.
Yeah, he has a role as the regional covering economic development, but as does Willie Jackson.
Will they be made to go to work?
That's a detail that has to come before Cabinet.
What's your view?
Ready to Work, when we came up with that program, our view was that you couldn't compel, but there are already sanctions that apply in our welfare system that we're not saying will change. So, for instance, if a course is brought up and it's seen to be beneficial to someone and help them, assist them into employment, then there are ways that we certainly encourage that people go into those.
He said, and I'll quote directly here, they will be made to go to work, end quote. Is he right?
And when further questioned on that, he said the details will go to Cabinet as well.
They will be made to go to work, and where it is necessary to pay them, they will have to receive a minimum wage. But there will be no more sitting on the couch. They will be made to go to work.
And when he was asked about what made to means, he said it would go to Cabinet, and it will.
So will they be made to go to work or not?
All of those decisions have to be made by our collective team. As I say, in the past, we've said that we saw compulsion as being not necessarily something that would work because, of course, you want to make sure that for the employer who you're potentially partnering with, that they've got someone who is eager to be there, ready to engage, and as a stepping stone into further employment. So, again, those are details we want to work through.
So they won't be made to go to work?
As I said, those are details we're working through.
Would there be a sanction regime?
We already have a sanction regime, Guy.
Yeah,
and
but
there's been a long-standing
the Greens
one.
were saying they didn't want a sanction regime at all. In fact, the Greens were going to cut out any... This is where we got to the whole Materia 2 Day
That's
thing.
actually an incorrect characterisation.
They wanted to remove almost all the benefit sanctions.
No, what they've said is they've seen sanctions applied that have unfairly affected families with kids.
You're saying they didn't want to remove benefit sanctions?
Not every single sanction in the regime. I've never heard them say that. But we have seen a change in the way sanctions have been used, and they were right to point that out.
Will this be a situation where people cannot go on the dole without having some sort of reciprocation of looking for work or taking up one of these schemes? Because he says there'll be no more sitting on the couch.
We're talking about a really specific group here, and I can see why Minister Jones is so passionate about this area. He speaks particularly around the young people he sees in Northland and that he's worried about. But the number that even make it onto a benefit is still a small chunk of the 70,000 young people not in employment, education or training. If you're asking me, am I willing to see that situation continue? We're not. But it's not just about making sure that they have the skills and that they have job opportunities. It's about making sure the jobs are there as well. In some of these regions, we do have a real dearth of opportunities for young people to move into. So it's a combination of both. Where Mr. Jones' primary responsibility falls in making sure that some of those opportunities are created, particularly in areas like forestry. Then it's a matter of making sure that those young people are given that chance, that hope, that dignity of work.
Do you believe that there are people who are sitting on the couch doing nothing because they can't be bothered working?
I don't believe that's the majority.
Because he's saying exactly that, isn't he? That there are people, never-do-well nephews, in his own poetic language, sitting on the couch doing nothing. That's what he said.
But I've also seen young people who are desperate for the dignity of work but just don't have those opportunities as well. There is a real mixture out there.
I'm just trying to work out what the coherent government philosophy on this is.
It is the motivation to get young people into work.
That's what sums it up?
Absolutely.
Can I talk now in the last half of this interview about government transparency? Because you've made something of a play, and I think you're the first government to have a Minister for Open Government. Yeah. So this secret document on the coalition agreement, why?
So secret that we're discussing it openly, yes.
Well, it is secret, isn't it?
Well, we've said that we don't consider it to be official information. That is true.
So Mr. Peters, the day after the coalition signing, said that this was, quote, a document of precision on various areas of policy commitment and development. Is he right in his characterisation
of that? The policy commitments that we've made absolutely have to be released, should be released, and they have been. That was the coalition document. What Mr. Peters is referring to is what I would characterise as a record minutes, some of the other conversations that were had during the period of negotiations. And look, those will exist for the National Party as much as they exist for us.
That's not a document of precision, though, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have characterised it necessarily in that way,
wrong,
but we've had a conversation. He
was wrong to call it a document of precision, was it?
I'm just reflecting the way that I would talk about it.
You wouldn't describe it in that way?
No, and since then, Mr. Peters has talked about the fact, and I agree with him, that at any point, if we are to further anything that came as a result of some of those conversations, then yes, absolutely, those will be made public. And the wider agenda that you've just referenced, we're actively at the moment looking at ways that we can make sure there's greater transparency around briefings that ministers receive, cabinet papers, whether we can routinely release documents after decisions are made. These are conversations I've never heard a government have before and that we're having. But so what you're asking about...
I'm quoting your own Deputy Prime Minister who made this comment the day after the signing of the coalition agreement.
Very early on in the piece.
Well, the ink was still fresh on the document, presumably. He called it a document of precision. You're saying that it is not a document of precision.
I've said I wouldn't describe it in that way. But look, that's for Mr. Peters to use language that he feels comfortable with. But of course, we've talked since about the fact that we would call it more a record of some of our conversations. The point here is, are there things that we have said in absolute terms that will be introduced? No, because that's already been released.
Are there directives to ministers in here?
Well, that document has never been issued to ministers.
Are there directives to ministers in there, though?
Well, if I haven't given it to ministers and issued it to ministers, then I wouldn't call it a directive to ministers.
Okay, because Mr. Peters, quote, these are directives to ministers with accountability and media strategies to ensure that the coalition works.
Yes, and there was a number of statements that have been made since by Mr. Peters around his perception of where we're at. Again, as I've said, Guyon, the issues that we are absolutely committed, that we have committed taxpayers' money to, have already been released, and it's right that they are. What you're asking me about is what I would call a wider record of our conversations. They do
and
not
what Mr. Peters calls directives to ministers and a document of precision.
And as I've said, it has not been issued directly to ministers with instructions to them, nor to officials.
Is there anything in there about Mr. Peters' role?
In where? In some of the negotiation documents?
In this secret document.
The secret document we're having an open conversation around. Mr. Peters' role is all set out in the expectation to ministers, which are all public.
So there's
coalition
there's nothing
agreement.
in this document about Mr. Peters' role and any circumstances under which his role might change.
No, not that I know necessarily what you're referring to, but no.
Well, there was some suggestion that there might be a part in this document which talked about what would happen if you were no longer Prime Minister. Nothing in there at all?
No.
So why don't you just put it out?
Because these are conversations that were had as part of a negotiating table. Some of them are just a record of the conversation had. It's not a work program that says.
The other guy, who's your Deputy Prime Minister, says that these are directives to ministers with accountability. It's a document of precision.
I would encourage you to look at some of his statements.
So who's right?
And I would encourage you to look at some of his statements since that time as well. As he said absolutely that when something becomes an official part of our work program, then that's the point at which absolutely we need to make sure we're transparent around that. But when it comes to documents that sit behind a negotiation that aren't necessarily going to be pursued, as soon as you release it, that gives an expectation that that is a hard and fast policy when it might not be at all.
One more question on this, though. Aren't we all big enough in New Zealand to have a look at this thing?
Well, again, that implies somehow, though, that it's the government's work program. That's the stuff that we need to be releasing. And this document, these documents around our negotiations don't necessarily represent that.
Okay, thank you for your time. Do appreciate it. Thanks for coming into the studio. That is the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. It's 23 minutes to 8.
Coming up before 8 on Morning Report.